Welcome to the New Republic show right now. I'm the host, Perry Bacon. I'm joined by Arkady Gurney today. Great to see you, Arkady.
Great to see you, Perry. Thanks
And
for having me on.
introduce him a little bit. He's a term, a democratic strategist, but he actually does real strategy. He's worked for a lot of organizations. He worked for CAP. He worked for Michael Bloomberg's gun control organization for some period. But last few years, he's worked on kind of thinking about how to take on Trump and how to use the powers of, let's call it, blue America, from cities to states to liberal institutions. He's done a lot of thinking and writing, and even before Trump became president the second time, wrote a fairly detailed report about how we should prepare for Trump. And the report, and the report actually argued that Trump 2.0 will be different, and therefore probably not the sort of protest model and the sort of getting the Mitt Romneys and John McCain's to vote against Trump would not exist anymore because their moderate Republicans on the Hill are essentially gone. And the protests would, probably worked the first time better because people were stunned by Trump. But now that he won a second time, or a different period. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Perry.
So let me start with asking, because I think, let me ask in a broad sense first. Is the resistance to Trump, how would you define how that's going?
Well, I think as you were describing the setup, the second version of Trump is harder than the first version. And I think there are three principal reasons why it's harder, which is they're different, we're different, and sort of the environment and some key institutions are different. So let's start with them, which is they're much more organized. They had a plan. They had Project 2025. They have defeated the internal opposition in the Republican Party. So the kinds of people like John McCain who were around in 2017 are not anymore. We're different, which is with we being sort of small d Democrats and big D Democrats, which is I think there's a lot of exhaustion. Some of that comes out of COVID. Some of that comes out of having done this once before. And there's a lot of division among Democrats about where to go. And I think that's an understandable and in some ways healthy debate, which is what's the right story for our party going forward? What's the right coalition? I think there's a lot of anxiety, understandably, about how the Democratic Party coalition seems to be falling apart. And then I think the third thing that makes this very challenging is that the environment is different. So some of the key institutions that were kind of pillars and guardrails in 2017 to 2020 are not there in the same way. One of those is the courts, where in large part because of Trump's first presidency, there's been a much more profound takeover of the federal courts, especially at the Supreme Court level. And then the other one is journalism, where your industry, Perry, where I think the years and years of stress on local journalism, national journalism, you see all the consolidation happening. You see people who have kind of more of a opinion, sort of a background like Barry Weiss taking over CBS News. It's very different from what we were in. So we shouldn't be surprised that resisting Trump and finding a path forward is much harder this time around than before. But obviously that makes the project all the more important.
So you were talking about what states could do even before Trump took office. So what did you imagine? Like, let's go back to the sort of initial writing you were doing. What did you hope states specifically? Why states? Why governors? Why particularly, like, obviously I mean like blue state governors.
Yep.
So talk about what you saw the potential for states. Why were they an important mechanism for resistance?
Well, I think states are, obviously fundamental in our structure and structure of democracy. And I think we don't think about it every day, but the United States is a creation of a bunch of states. It's sort of the outcome of a contract between states. And we think of divided power as between Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidency. But another critical part of the constitutional structure is the divide between federal power and state power. And if you look at American history, for better or worse, and for probably most of American history, it's been for the worse. States have been an enormous source of power and resistance to the federal government. You saw after the Civil War, there was 100 years where a group of states were able to resist civil rights, and it signals the sort of structural centrality that states have. And if you think about kind of, California's economy is the fourth largest economy in the world, and an enormous number of kind of policy areas, schools, sanitation, things that are kind of our daily life things. Most of that is done at the state level. And so there's an enormous source of power. I think the other reason to think about states is if you look at the Biden years and try to think what was the MAGA opposition that put Trump back in power. I think we can think that the center of gravity was at Mar-a-Lago and on Trump's Twitter or Truth Social account. But I think the true centers of gravity were in state capitals where Republican governors and attorney generals and treasurers were using their power in a coordinated way and an unprecedented way to undermine the Biden administration and to sort of push their policy prerogatives forward, interfere with blue states. You saw migrant busing where Texas moved 125,000 migrants, undocumented migrants, into New York and Illinois and other states that precipitated a sort of logistical crisis, a political crisis. So I think you have a little bit of a model of what states can do to push forward their own prerogatives, to work together, and to undermine a federal government that they disagree with.
So that model, while I don't agree with its policy vision, was a model that was coordinated. You're talking about Greg Abbott, you're talking about attorney generals in various red states. So you had written before Trump took over, here's a model we should use. So
Yep.
how is that going? Like, are the Democratic governors and Democratic states doing something? Let's tell the good story first. What are the parts of that model or a coordinated model they have used?
Well, I think a lot of it is happening. First of all, like, let's not pretend this is an easy pathway or some sort of silver bullet. This is a very hard, challenging position that these governors and attorneys general are in. But if you look at, for example, the attorneys general, they've filed hundreds of cases to block Trump administration initiatives, to block the Trump administration from stealing money from states that they're obligated by statute to provide. Many of those lawsuits have been successful, at least at the preliminary stages. I think you see among governors, many of them finding their own way to push back and push against the Trump administration. Obviously, a big one is, Trump basically ordered Republican governors, particularly Greg Abbott in Texas, to redistrict their states to try to get an advantage in the 2026 congressional elections, which Texas has proceeded to do. Other Republican states are looking at doing it. The Texas legislators, the Democrats, left the state to try to temporarily block it. But the real response that's available to blue states is to counter. And that's what California has done. And Gavin Newsom has led an effort to get an initiative on the ballot to allow California to override its independent redistricting for several cycles of elections to counter Texas. And that's not because Democrats are against independent redistricting, but I think they have to understand that if you have one side that is trying to steal an election because they can't win, talking about the OBB mega bill that takes away health care for millions of people and cuts taxes for billionaires, that you need a way to respond when they are stacking the deck in their favor. And so I think you see more of that happening. And I think the redistricting thing was something of a mind shift where you saw some of the governors becoming more active. Obviously, an area of big challenge. I'm in Chicago today. Is the issue of ICE and federal agents and National Guard troops who are in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., which of course is not a state, which ties their hands a little bit in how they can push back. And clearly this is over the will of the people in those states, over the will of the governors of those states, and trying to provoke a crisis. And so I think that the governors are working on how do you respond to this challenge. It's not easy, but I think there are a lot of tools and levers that they're beginning to use, and more that they can use to take the initiative narratively, but also using legal power, economic power, political power.
Because I guess one thing maybe I didn't anticipate, maybe you did, was how aggressively Trump has sort of gone after blue states, blue cities, particularly. I don't think I expected maybe the ICE raids. I expected the combination of the ICE and the National Guard. In some ways, like the Trump administration is like really taking on cities in a way they didn't the first time around. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think that it's not just that, one way to interpret it would be that blue states have a bunch of policies that Trump and his allies don't seem to like. Things like Medicaid expansion that gives more health care to low and middle income working people. And that, the reason that blue states are getting targeted more is because they're going after policies they don't like. But even if that's part of it, if you look at what they're actually doing, they're clearly picking fights and trying to really target blue states, even on things would seem to be more neutral. So, for example, the Department of Transportation is rewriting its grant funding formulas to take into account a bunch of factors that will lead to blue states getting less funding and red states getting more funding. And it's really interesting because in the Biden administration, you saw Democrats kind of do the opposite of this, which is in the construction of the IRA, the big Biden bill that put a lot of investment in clean energy infrastructure. The structure of the bill actually sent more money to red states and red districts. And part of the political strategy behind that was like, hey, let's get representatives from people who don't agree with us as much on this to see the benefit of this policy. What you see with Trump is the opposite, which is reward your friends, punish your enemies, and beat them into submission. And but I think there's a strategy to counter that.
Talk about the I'm leery of these terms, but there's a piece in I think the Mother Jones that haven't got to read yet, but talks about the idea of California is doing a soft succession. Some of my other guests have used the term civil war. Not that we have an issue like slavery, but more that the Civil War had a big element of states being in conflict with the federal government. Is there a real level of conflict between the blue states and the federal government right now, and resistance from the states to the federal government? I don't love the term civil war, but we're in something like that kind of conflict, right?
Yeah, look, I think we want to be careful with these kinds of terms.
Yeah.
And the probably the metaphor that I've thought about the most is sort of a cold civil war, and really a cold war, which is something like the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, which is there are flashpoints. There are moments of actual, I guess, violent conflict or violent outbursts, but it's really about two opposing ideologies and sort of a battle for relative power. And I think when you view it in that lens, I think one of the best pathways. I think that most big D Democrats and small D Democrats who want to save American democracy, the objective is to get through this era and to get to some sort of new normal, some sort of more stable agreement between the various factions and states in our country, and something that is durable and frankly more united. But how do we get from where we are to that? And in my mind, a sort of critical kind of a set of approaches are deterrence and hardball, which is and I think you see this in the redistricting context. If you don't like partisan redistricting, if you let one side unilaterally do it, they're going to keep doing it. The way to get to some sort of compromise is to credibly convince Republicans, hey, you can do a mid-cycle redistricting, which, by the way, it costs money. It's sort of a mess. It's not good for voters because one election you have one representative, another election you have another representative. It messes up accountability. It's not a good way to run a country. But if they think they can get a political advantage or a partisan advantage, they're going to do it. But if you can credibly show that you're not going to let that happen, you're creating the conditions where some sort of detente or compromise is more possible. And I think we need to think in that mindset in a lot of different areas. because I think, number one, I think it'll be critical to get through the next 3 years, but this is not a 3-year problem, which is, even if a Democrat is elected in 2029, even if Democrats win the House and Senate, um, I don't think this is going to reset to normal on its own, in part because the MAGA has taken over the federal courts. There is this sort of decades of federalism jurisprudence, which essentially pushes power down to the states. And I think we should be interested in state and local power because that's where we're going to solve a lot of the problems that our country faces too. For example, inside the Democratic coalition, a big debate in the last, year has been the sort of abundance theory of where Democrats should go. That's Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson wrote a book by that title, but other people have been talking about it. And it's sort of a critique of blue states and how they've been governed and how they've kind of tied their hands on building up clean energy and housing and things like that. And I think that is, whether you like it or not, is something to think about, which is I think we need to be more focused on how we can leverage our power, make progress, attract people to blue states. Because I think there are essentially two competing worldviews in this country, and if people who want to save democracy, if we want to do that, we have to both counter the interference in our own states where it's happening, but we also have to grow and build people, build places that people want to be part of. A big challenge for blue states in the last 5 years, for example, is there's been a net population loss from blue states to red states of 5 million people. That's driven especially by affordability. Um, and that's something that's got to change. So like it can't. There is no political future for blue states or Democrats in this country if it becomes like very nice upper middle class suburban super liberal places where only a handful of people can afford to live. Um, that's not going to work. And so I think there's a lot of work to do both to counter red states and a hostile federal government, but also to reimagine how we govern in blue states and cities to make them really great places to live across the board.
Let me drill in a couple of things you said. Cold Civil War. Did that start in 2015 or 2025, or what's the time period just to help them? Because it's not just about Trump. In some ways, these
Yeah,
competing ideologies have existed a little bit longer. Define that term a little bit if you don't, or
I think
define the
it's
time that
probably.
we're talking about.
I think if you look at sort of a few different indicators in sort of data and research, it's probably been going on or growing for about 30 years. So I think it kind of started in the 1990s. So, for example, um, one measure of kind of differences between blue states and red states are the laws they end up adopting on different issues. And a few researchers have looked at what I would term policy divergence, which is the trend of blue states and red states adopting more divergent, different policies across different issues. So, guns, abortion, taxes, you name it. And if you look from the New Deal to basically the year 2000, across all these issues, there isn't growing differences between blue states and red states in the policies they're adopting. If anything, there is some convergence. The policies are becoming less differentiated across these blocks of states. But in the last 25 years, that difference just keeps growing and growing and growing. So the difference between living in a blue state and a red state has become much more consequential. So, for example, if you go to some other country and somebody asks you, "Hey, Perry, tell me, what are the laws on guns in America?" I mean, it totally depends where you are. It's pretty different in Massachusetts and Kentucky. What are the laws on abortion in America? We used to have a somewhat consistent set of rules on abortion. Now we have wildly varied rules. And so I think that's made this contest more consequential, which is, I think, part of what these blocks of states and parties are looking for when they take power in the federal government is, hey, can we take our way and impose it on the rest of the country? Ideologically, conservatives used to talk 30 years ago about small government, about devolving power to the states. But you see in Trump probably the most maximalist president in terms of executive power. It's not just putting power in the executive branch. It's about trying to, intimidate the Federal Reserve, get rid of independent agencies, and put all the power in the president himself. And that's a real, I think, danger in terms of the risk of autocracy. And I think there's a playbook about how to respond to that. And I think state power and a state response is at the center of that playbook.
So you said you mentioned some highlights of the coordinated lawsuits, coordination in terms of lawsuits, particularly the highlights of. So those are the highlights of Blue America response. What are some things you wish there was more?
Yep.
That are some lowlights or like things that have not happened the way you wish they were in terms of the blue state response?
Well, I think that there's one thing from the red state response in the Biden years is you saw a lot of activity trying to push corporate decision making. So red states didn't like ESG, that's environmental, social, governance, investing strategies. They didn't like DEI, and they started using their pension fund investments and state procurement power to push companies out of those kinds of practices. So, for example, Texas took $8 billion from the teachers' pension fund and pulled it out of BlackRock, a big Wall Street financial firm that was the biggest promoter of this sort of environmental investment strategy. BlackRock pulled out of ESG investing. They eventually have gotten off Texas's blacklist, and they've really used that power as investors, as procurers, to change corporate America. And that's a battle that blue states should be more effective in fighting, in part because blue states have larger economies, higher GDP per capita. They have larger state governments, so they have more, and they have larger state workforces with more generous pension benefits. So if you look at pensions, blue states have 75% more money invested than red states. So it's like a middleweight fighter taking on a heavyweight fighter, but the heavyweight fighter hasn't responded. So Republicans talk a lot about woke capitalism and how how government is interfering in the marketplace, but in the last few years they're the ones who've been doing it. And you see this now at the federal level where Trump is kind of going company by company and investing money in Intel. And there is sort of if we wonder why has there been sort of this widespread corporate capitulation to Trump, I don't think it started right after the election. It started a few years ago when these states started using their power. And again, it may not be something we want to do. What we probably should be doing with pension fund investments is trying to get the best return possible so that firefighters and teachers can retire securely and safely. But if red states are going to use that power to try to push around companies and control their practices and turn them into people who will fund their campaigns, I think the blue states need to use powers like that, places where they actually have more power, to respond accordingly.
You used the words hardball and deterrence a few minutes ago. So I think
Yeah.
part of this is, even we've talked a few times. Every time you talk, I'm sort of like, oh, do I really want California to be using their pension to like force? But the answer to these questions has got to be yes. As part of what you're saying is things that make me queasy, is sort of in a liberal way, are going to we're in a fight over power, and that requires hardball. Is that the sort of subtext here, or the actual text?
I think that's right. I mean, I think, look, I think that we want, for example, in the last 24 hours, Governor Pritzker and Governor Newsom sent letters to the National Governors Association, which is the bipartisan 50 governor coalition of governors, and they said, "Hey, if you're not going to say something about National Guard troops coming into our states without our request, we're going to drop out of this organization."
Oh, wow.
And I think it's a healthy response to something that's not working anymore. And like, if we're gonna, I think we have to be able to like look squarely at what we have. End of the day, yes, we want to have a national bipartisan governors association where they talk about ideas across party lines, but if the red state governors are not going to say something about something that is, kind of an across the board violation of the Constitution and about the role of states, what's the point of being in something like this? And I think there's, I talked about some of the challenges that blue states have around affordability and this sort of net migration towards red states. Blue states have a lot to be proud of too, which is if you look at educational outcomes, if you look at life expectancy, there's a big difference. If you look at crime in cities, Republicans talk a lot about crime in Chicago and cities like that. But if you look at crime across states and control for urbanization, there's more crime in red states, and that's a lot. There are a lot of reasons for that. Um, but I think, so I think there's a lot that is going reasonably well in blue states, and part of what you want to do is tell that story. And there's some places where you can kind of leverage those differences. So, there's insurance regulation at the state level, and you can, should people be subsidizing Florida property insurance when there's all this home insurance risk in Florida because the policies are not doing anything about climate change. I think there's a lot of tools that are potentially available to create economic pressure to get the kinds of policy incentives that I think more of us would like to see.
You named, yeah, I think we've talked about Pritzker and Newsom a few times. We've talked about Democratic AGs. Are the other Democratic governors involved in resisting? And I don't know that as much. Like I don't think I know, but part of it is Newsom and Pritzker are presumably running for president. So I think that's part of what's going on, and that's what the media covers them. But are the other Democratic governors involved in resisting?
I think different governors are taking different approaches, and of course, they represent very different states. I think Perry, you're from Kentucky, so you've got a Democratic governor, Beshear, who's in a very red state, and I think the right answer for governors is you can't do it. Everyone does the same thing. But I do think you see a number of governors who are kind of creatively pushing back in different ways. So, for example, President Trump was talking about sending National Guard to Baltimore, and Baltimore's out of control crime, when in fact crime's been going down a lot in Baltimore for many years. Wes Moore, the governor there, said, "Hey, why don't you come to Baltimore and walk around with me?" And like come see for yourself. I thought it was a sort of creative, kind of playful response that kind of shut the president up. I think another governor who I think has handled this era pretty well is Kathy Hochul, the New York State governor. She was after the November election, I think had the second lowest favorability rating of any governor in the country. Now she has a positive favorability rating, and I think part of that is she's counterpunched in different ways at different times with the Trump administration. She's done that even though there are things that the state has to negotiate with the Trump administration around. So, for example, there's a congestion pricing plan for New York City that has to do with how cars are tolled to reduce congestion and raise revenue. The Trump administration tries to block it, but I think she's both been, punching at times, negotiating at other times, and I think that's the best strategy with Trump, which is if you kind of like if you put your hands up right away, he's just going to bowl you over and keep taking.
Let's move to other institutions and before we close here. I want to talk about cities. Let's talk about cities first. Are there useful things cities are doing, and there are useful resistance cities, and there are things that cities could be doing better.
I think, yeah. I mean, cities. Obviously, cities vary enormously in their size, their budgets, etc. A huge, a city
Let's
that's
say
bigger.
the 50 large. Let's say the Boston, Chicago.
Absolutely.
Let's say the 50 largest cities for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that cities, they have a huge. They're on the front lines of these questions, whether it's crime or education, and so I think they have real choices to make about how much are they going to facilitate things like the ICE raids, or not participate, or try to protect people. So I think there is a lot for cities to do. I think their hands constitutionally are a bit more tied up than states, which is states have The cities don't exist in the Constitution. States do, and cities are basically creations of states. So in some states, cities are very powerful. So New York City has a massive budget. Um, New York City's budget is the size of the state of Florida's. Um, and so, right now there's this mayoral campaign, and Zoran Mandami seems like he's the favorite to win this general election. And I think that will be a real bellwether for other mayors. I also think it'll be a real point of contestation with Trump, which is Trump's from New York. It's the biggest city. He definitely has wanted to use Mandami as something of a foil, and I think you may see a lot of confrontation shifting to New York in the new year with a new mayor.
We mentioned corporations a little bit earlier, but I mean, it's corporations. I wish they were doing more, but is that probably the most logical place where, of course, they're falling in line? Is that maybe I should have, there's nothing to expect beyond that? Or, yeah.
I mean, I think that look, I think that there's been a massive capitulation
Yeah.
by businesses, and I think that they're going to look at their bottom lines and take the path of least resistance is what businesses are mostly going to do. Um, but I also think there's been some mistakes and overreactions, which is, um, for example, in the capitulating law firms, there were a lot of big law firms that were under pressure from Trump to settle with the Trump administration and offer free legal services to President Trump's preferred causes. Um, the law firms that settled, a lot of them have lost lawyers who've left. They've lost some clients. And then the law firms that fought back, based on what accounts there are, seem to be doing quite well. And I think part of that is, if you're in a dispute with somebody, do you want to hire the lawyer who might be like cowed and might give up because there's a little bit of pressure, or do you want to hire the lawyer who's the one who's like never going to back down? And I think I think it's a real problem for them. Big businesses, global businesses, they have to recognize, yes, who's the president of the United States matters, what the policies of the United States are matter, but they also have to sell across these 50 states, and like who the governors are and what the policies are in those states matter, what policies are around the world matter. And so, for example, and they also have to think about what's rational for their businesses. So as it relates, for example, to climate change, Donald Trump may decide that climate change is a hoax and he hates the windmills and wants to, push businesses out of that. And I think he's had some success in bullying some businesses so far, but they have to think, what is the real challenge here? What are the other markets and actors who are ultimately going to set the rules around this? And what is the strategy that ultimately makes sense? And I think that there is a lot of power in influencing those decisions. Um, especially among blue states. And if you can coordinate your regulatory incentives, I think you may see businesses begin to behave differently. And I think you may see them begin to behave differently as we get closer to the end of the Trump administration, which is, despite his threats to run for a third term, which he's not constitutionally allowed to do, someday this is going to end. It doesn't mean the challenges are going to end, but I think that every actor is going to be assessing, what makes sense for me this month, but also they'll be remembering what they do this month may have consequences 12 months, 24 months from now.
Let me close. We're going to the end here on. I want to hit four other institutions, and I'll give you or four other parts of our society, and I'll give my views on them, and then see what you think. So my sense is, congressional Democrats started off pretty poorly. In terms of resisting, but have gotten more aggressive now. I think you've been urging me when you and I talked to sort of states might be a better venue for this in any way because they have more actual power. But I think congressional Democrats have gotten better, but are not great. I think the public has been there from the beginning. If you look at the No Kings protest and things like the public and Trump's approval rating has gone down a lot. The public seems to be resisting and opposing pretty strongly, I'd say. Higher education, I've been very disappointed by, and surprisingly so. Another place where I think capitulation has been too fast and really bad. And then the news media is another place I would say has been generally disappointing, but you've got great work at ProPublica. Some of the New Republic, some of the more left-wing publications have done pretty well, I'd say, but the sort of mainstream. So news media, higher ed, congressional Democrats, the public. So any of those you want to take, any of those you disagree with me about or want to amplify about?
Um, uh, I'll try to do a little bit of each. I mean, I think, congressional Democrats, I appreciate what they're doing right now with the standoff around the shutdown. I think I think they have settled on a clear ask around healthcare that I think is that makes a lot of sense. I also think that their actual leverage and actual power is quite limited. And so that they have a hard hand to play. And so part of the reason we've been more focused on states and governors and attorneys general is we think they just have a lot more that they can do to successfully obstruct and offer a different path forward. I think on media, it's a huge challenge, as that started long before the Trump administration, which is because of changes in the social media platforms, how advertising works. There's been incredible stress in this industry that's driving some consolidation. But what's really of concern, I think, is the Trump administration is using its leverage as a regulator to influence to make media organizations capitulate. There was the bogus Disney George Stephanopoulos settlement. Then there was the 60 Minutes bogus settlement and lawsuit. And I think what you're seeing, Republicans have complained for a long time about mainstream media. I think what's going to be left of mainstream media in a couple of years is very consolidated and largely aligned with Trump. And so I think it'll be really important in this environment for there to be more alternative media and for people to become part of the media more. And I think it'll be a lot of Substack video chats and newsletters and different places will be essential. It doesn't mean that all the pillars of media are falling apart. I mean, I think a lot of people complain about the New York Times, but I think they've probably handled this last 10 months reasonably well. But it's a real challenge.
Um, And on that note, I think it's been a great conversation. I think you've given us anything you want to finish on. You've given us some positive things, I think, to think about, which I think is important. In that the states are resisting. I think it's an important story here, and I think you're kind of explaining. Anything else you want to finish on? Anything else you want to add?
I mean, I think I guess my advice for just regular people who are trying to figure out how to get involved and make a difference, I would really, people have often said, think globally, act locally. I would really look around you and your city councils, your state legislators, your state controllers, offices that you may not be paying attention to, and start thinking about what do you want from them? How could it make where you are work better and be a better place to live? But also, how can they do something to use your power to help them use their power to push back?
That's great. Arkady, where can people find your work? I don't think you do a ton of social media, but the things you've written that you want to highlight?
You can find some, had a op-ed in the Washington Post, something in Democracy Journal, the American Prospect. If you Google my name, you'll find it. But hopefully more coming soon.
Good. Arkady, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
Thanks, Barry. Bye.